know the why human trafficking work is needed? To fight for the freedom of modern-day slaves. But love, passion, commitment isn't all you need to be an effective and successful anti-trafficking advocate. Learn the how. I'm Dr. Celia Williamson, Director of the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute at the University of Toledo. Welcome to the Emancipation Nation podcast, where I'll provide you with the latest and best methods, policy, and practice discussed by experienced experts in the field so that you can cut through the noise, save time, and be about the work of saving lives. Welcome back to the Emancipation Nation podcast. Today, I'm talking to Caroline Palmer. She's the Safe Harbor Director at the Minnesota Department of Health. Caroline is an attorney, and an attorney in the purest sense of the word, meaning that her whole resume reads as if she's a social justice advocate, because that's exactly what she is. She's worked at the Mitchell-Hamline School of Law. She's been a freelance writer. She worked for the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. She's done some pro bono work as the pro bono development director at the Minnesota State Bar Association. She's been a staff attorney at the Minnesota AIDS Project. So you can see that following her career, she's really been about social and economic justice and creating change for people who are vulnerable. So welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, we are honored to have you on here. So you've been the director of the Safe Harbor since 2011 or so?
No, actually, I've been the director of Safe Harbor here in Minnesota since 2018. The Safe Harbor program came into effect in Minnesota in 2011.
Oh, okay. And so what do you do as the director of a Safe Harbor law?
Yeah, it's an interesting position to be in. So the state legislature, when it created our Safe Harbor law back in 2011, decided that part of the planning should go into having a statewide director who would be in charge of coordinating the system and making sure that the funding that was going out to the supportive services providers was being handled. One of the great things about the way the state of Minnesota approached Safe Harbor was to create a public health response. In many other states where there's a safe harbor law, which means we're recognizing that youth under the age of 18 cannot be criminalized for being prostituted or exploited or trafficked, they oftentimes rely on a very public safety approach, which is appropriate. But at the same time, here in Minnesota, we also wanted to bring public health into the picture too. So the Minnesota Department of Health became the home of the Safe Harbor Director position in 2014.
So hold on, you all passed the Safe Harbor law and you actually put some money behind the law that you passed, because a lot of states have not done that.
Yes, actually, our state has been very good about putting money behind our safe harbor work. And that was actually a key part of the advocacy in Safe Harbor was, it's great to make this change, but unless we have supports and services for youth who are affected, there's not a lot we can do. So funds have been put towards shelter, towards supportive services, evaluation, protocol teams, training.
Was that because of the perspective when you said your state took a public health perspective as opposed to what was the other thing, and what's the difference?
Well, a lot of states, have taken a public safety approach, and of course, it's part of it. They'll often put their safe harbor work in an attorney general's office or a public safety department. Here in Minnesota, we centered it in our public health, in our Department of Health, and we coordinate with our public safety and human services and human rights folks across the state.
So what's the difference between, running it through public safety or running it through public health? What's the difference?
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things about taking a health approach is we're recognizing that there are many, many different factors that come into play that impact trafficking and exploitation. So we really want to further a health equity approach, for example. We know that many factors come into play in communities. And so from a public health perspective, we're looking at everything from, what a community health looks like. We have a sexual violence prevention program here in our Minnesota Department of Health. So we're very much taking a prevention perspective, which is key to public health. And we're combining that with the public safety and the human services responses. That also gives us a nice opportunity to partner with lots of other aspects of our public health approach, which include everything from mental health to drug use to alcohol use to suicide to infectious disease. We can kind of pull together all of these different factors into having a conversation about how we respond to trafficking and exploitation.
And the importance of safe harbor is, and tell me the nuances in Minnesota, if they're different, but basically anyone under the age of 18 that is involved in the commercial sex industry is automatically seen as a person in need of services, somebody that's not going to be criminalized through juvenile court, but somebody that might be seen in other social service areas because they are in need of support instead of being criminalized. Is that correct?
Exactly. They are offered support and services, and they are treated as victims. And then once they reach the age of 18, while the criminalization piece might come into being a factor at that point, we actually do extend access to safe harbor services through age 24. So we recognize that at age 18, everything doesn't necessarily get better. So we want them to be able to continue access to those services. And then we've had broader conversations in our state about safe harbor for all, which could potentially remove the criminalization piece from age 18.
Now, how did you get legislators and people in general to move safe harbor all the way up to age 24?
Well, it actually became a great relationship with the way that we were working with runaway youth in our state. So we already had a law in our state that recognized supports and services for them up to age 24. And so believing that we were working with many of the same populations, we were able to get the legislature to go ahead and raise the cap for safe harbor services and access to age 24. It didn't change the criminalization piece, that's still 18, but they definitely wanted to align with how we work with runaway and homeless youth.
Wow. And so if you do identify, if someone identifies a trafficked youth, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's somebody, a social service provider, do they ever call juvenile court? Does the young person ever go to juvenile detention? Or how is that person linked? Where do they go first and who are they linked to?
Well, it may depend on where they are accessed, and that's why we have a model in our state called No Wrong Door. Essentially, what we want to make sure is whoever is encountering a youth will be able to get them to the appropriate services. So, for example, if they are connecting through law enforcement or through a medical encounter, all of these folks know that in their communities, they have somebody called a regional navigator. We have 8 regional navigators located throughout our state, and that can be a first call. If they're not sure where the youth should go, they will connect with the regional navigator, and that person essentially helps the youth get on to whatever the next appropriate resource is for them. The regional navigator may actually work with them internally in their own agency with particular resources, particularly if they have shelter or support, or they may be working in the community to find another connection for them. Another way that they get to support and services is a lot of times wherever that youth may enter the system. If it's not a regional navigator, there is a lot of knowledge now about the other types of supportive services available in the community, and so those might be called. But really, we try to really make the first point of contact into the safe harbor system whenever possible, this regional navigator who can really help partner with that youth and help them move through the system.
Wow. And how did you get people all across your state to understand the concept of no wrong door? I mean, if a young person presents themselves as a trafficking victim or shows some red flags or indicators and that person believes, how does Minnesota know that these front door people, these frontline workers may recognize somebody as a victim and take it as their responsibility and their agency to link this person to one of the regional navigators? How does that even happen?
Well, that's really taken a lot of training and awareness raising. Once the No Wrong Door model was put in place and the safe harbor system kind of really went online in 2014 after the law was passed in 2011, there was the planning, and then in 2014, kind of the system started to go. There's just really been constant outreach through many different sources. For example, when Safe Harbor first kind of got up and running, oh boy, there was probably about 2,500 law enforcement officers trained And there were regional navigator conferences throughout the state to bring in different parts of the system. As federal law has changed, the child welfare system has become much more engaged. And so our Department of Human Services is actively working to train folks in the child welfare system. There's a lot of outreach support going on with homeless youth shelter and supportive services communities. I mean, really any sort of way that you think a youth might encounter help, we've been trying to reach out to them. It's through schools, it's through healthcare. I mean, I can just think of so many trainings over the years. And the other way that we've been really working closely with in our state is we have 11 tribal nations located here, and we have funding going to 9 of those. 9 of them identified that they wanted to receive funding. And so they're actively working within their own governments to raise awareness too.
Wow. And so having done all this work across the state, has Minnesota found that they are identifying more victims, or about how many victims, if you know, does Minnesota identify?
Well, as part of our Safe Harbor funding, we are required to conduct an evaluation every couple of years, and we're actually just about to release our numbers for 2019 that will cover the past 2 years of services. But I think over the time period that we have been doing evaluations, there have been about 2,500 identified cases that have used Safe Harbor services. That's just in the supportive services side of things. The child welfare end has been also tracking cases as well. They have several hundred that they've identified coming through their doors. And then, we also have our State Department of Public Safety. They're doing their own statistical analysis, and they're counting cases as well. So, sometimes you may have some overlap there, but we do know that these are services that are regularly used, and that we have youth who have moved through these services toward hopefully getting towards some healing in their lives.
Wow. So you're saying that over the course of 2 years, about 2,500 young people have been identified or using Safe Harbor. We can conclude that they're likely trafficking victims. Do you know?
It could be trafficking or exploitation. It could involve a third-party trafficker, or it could be some other form of commercial sexual exploitation.
And so when you differentiate the two, what do you mean by somebody who's exploited and somebody who's trafficked?
Sure. So trafficking is really a type of commercial sexual exploitation where under our Minnesota law, it involves the prostitution of an individual in which there's a third person who facilitates or profits. That doesn't count the buyer or the victim, but it's actually that facilitator who is profiting from the interaction. And then commercial sexual exploitation is a bit broader. It occurs when someone exchanges sex for anything of value or promises something of value. And that can be money, but it could also be drugs, food, shelter, rent, higher status in a gang or group. There doesn't have to be a third person involved in that exchange.
So it could be a runaway who trades sex for a safe place to stay, or like you said,
Yes.
Food or shelter, drugs, money items. Does
Absolutely.
Minnesota treat exploited youth and trafficked youth the same under the Safe Harbor law?
Yes. I mean, it really is meant to address trafficking and exploitation. So, for example, the services that we provide, they could be for somebody who is being trafficked or being exploited. And a lot of times they're also looking at whether they're at risk. That's a big piece of it, too. We're hoping to bring some of that prevention perspective in this, too, to make sure that we are helping youth who, might have a toe in, but could use some assistance to move toward another direction.
And so is that part of, are they eligible under Safe Harbor at-risk kids yet?
Yes, they are. And that's so important because I think what it does is it helps our service providers identify some directions they may be able to take. And one thing that we're really spreading in our state, and you're probably familiar with this training resource by Love 146 called Not a Number. We have been actively training facilitators in our state for a while now and offering that course to youth about how to respond to trafficking and exploitation.
Yeah. And so this number of 2,500, I want to go back to, that includes trafficked kids, exploited kids, and kids that are at risk?
Yeah, it could be a range, yes, of different types of experiences that might be presented to that particular provider.
That's amazing. And so currently, women in Minnesota that are 18 and over that are involved in commercial sex, maybe they're trafficking victims, maybe they're not. What happens to them in Minnesota? And I know you're working on some version of decriminalization, but what currently happens with the adults, whether they're men or women?
Sure. So for adults right now, as you noted, at age 18, it is criminalized. Although I will say the advent of safe harbor in this state has had an impact on how criminal justice tends to look at prostitution and how we treat adults going through the system. Sometimes they're not arrested. Sometimes they are going through a diversion program. Sometimes they're referred right to services. We have a couple of programs here in Minnesota that are known for their work with adults, including Breaking Free and Pride. And so they do have a couple of resources where they can access support and services. And of course, because Safe Harbor goes up to age 24, they're welcome to access those services as well. But we definitely hear from people that once they get beyond age 24, there's a real gap in need. And so the couple of places that we do have, like Breaking Free, for example, helps somebody regardless of their age, but they're just located here in the Twin Cities, although they do a lot of outreach throughout the state. We definitely need a lot more support and services for adults.
And Breaking Free has been around for a very long time, way before this whole issue even became popular. What about labor trafficking of young people or adults in Minnesota? Do you see much of that?
That's really starting to get a lot more attention now. We received a federal grant from the Office of Victims of Crime, and that allowed the Department of Health the opportunity to expand its work into labor trafficking because our state legislature has really focused on sex trafficking. With the labor trafficking work, we've been able to partner with some organizations in our community that work specifically with victims of labor trafficking. We know that labor trafficking is certainly occurring in construction and agriculture and other venues throughout the state. And it's only just now starting to get more attention and people are starting to feel a little safer about coming forward. We have a new wage theft law that just went into effect this summer, and I think that's going to go a long way toward raising attention to labor exploitation and labor trafficking. So essentially what that looks like is situations in which somebody may have been promised pay for a particular kind of work. They don't receive it. They may get strung along and they're continuing to not receive their pay. So we look at that as a form of exploitation. It's a little different than labor trafficking where you might, again, have that facilitator in place. But, somebody has gone to do a construction job. They keep getting promised their pay. They're not getting it. So that is more of a wage theft type of approach. And our Department of Labor here in our state is going to be much more actively training and enforcing on that issue. The other thing I was going to say with regard to labor trafficking is under our federal grant, we have funding from the Advocates for Human Rights for the Advocates for Human Rights here in Minnesota. And they actually put together a labor trafficking protocol. And they are actively working now with the city of Minneapolis to implement that and hoping to partner with other folks around the state. Because I think part of recognizing labor trafficking is really getting people trained in the same way that we did around safe harbor and sex trafficking. And the more outreach there is and the more recognition, we think people will feel more comfortable about coming forward and reporting.
Mm-hmm. And so what type of labor trafficking have you seen there in Minnesota? And is it mostly foreign victims or domestic victims as well?
It's been both. There's been very few prosecutions. The couple of prosecutions where there have involved foreign-born victims in a domestic servant type of situation. But we also recognize that there's a case coming up soon in Minneapolis on a construction matter. And there's also been cases coming up in our, we have a lot of agricultural communities and a lot of migrant workers coming through our state. So that's another area. Hair braiding salons is another place where they've been looking at potential trafficking or exploitation. So those are kind of the key ones that pop to mind.
Wow. So Caroline, I have to ask, because as we have advocates that are listening and they want to get involved, I imagine that they want to know, what's really, really great about what you do and what really, really sucks about what you do.
I'll start with the positive. So what's really great about this position here at the Department of Health is I feel very fortunate because we are working to support all of the people who are doing the work on the ground. We have over 40 grantees in our safe harbor system that are providing services and shelter and protocol development and street outreach and evaluation. And they are just doing amazing work across the state. And they're doing it in ways that's really tailored to where they are in the state. Because what might be appropriate here in the Twin Cities is not necessarily going to be best for a rural part of the state. So people are really customizing how they respond, partnering, and just doing amazing work, I think, all over the state. And every day I feel really lucky to just kind of come in here and keep things moving, because I know out in the world, all over the place, they're the ones that are seeing the survivors, helping them to get through to the supports that they need and helping the cases to move forward. So it's really inspiring, and I feel very fortunate to be in this position to support that. What sucks is there's always more work we need to do. We work hard. We have some good money in our state to support this, but there's still lots of gaps that we have to fill. We still don't have enough housing for everybody who needs it. We definitely need more supports and services to expand to survivors who are over the age of 24. We definitely need more supports and services for labor trafficking. That's only just kind of really getting off the ground now. And we need more education for youth. There's a lot of interest on the part of youth about learning to prevent trafficking and exploitation. And we love that they have that interest, and we want to continue to promote that. And we also just want to continue to promote in general comprehensive sexual health education and just basic understanding about relationships too, because so much of that is important to helping youth be able to respond to trafficking and exploitation. So the list never ends. It keeps us very busy, and we always have things we need to do, and we always have things that we need to attend to address the needs of so many people here in the state. And I guess I would add to that too, as I mentioned earlier, we have 11 tribal nations in our state, so that's 11 governments that we're also partnering with, and we need so many more resources to be going into our partnerships with our tribal nations here in Minnesota.
Wow. So what do you do? I mean, describe your typical day. You get up and then what do you do?
I have a lot of meetings. So I am doing everything from coordinating with our partners in human services or public safety. A lot of times we're planning trainings, or we're creating policies, or we're developing tools. We might be coordinating our process internally here at MDH in order to give out our funding. We're getting ready to do our request for proposals again in the next few months. And so we have to get prepared to get everybody through an application process and a review process to get the funding out. We respond to requests from all over the state and the country for technical assistance with regard to everything from how to develop a safe harbor system to best practices in different disciplines to responding to safe harbor. We might be coordinating with the Department of Public Safety and the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension on their own training that they're doing for law enforcement. We might be talking with child welfare and looking over materials that they're putting together to train their folks. It really is just a wide variety of opportunities. We're also able to do some national work. We are working on Safe Harbor for All, which is a plan to look at how we can expand services and potentially look at a partial decriminalization approach where persons who are selling would not be criminalized, but buyers still would be. And we're speaking a lot at national conferences about that model. And there's a lot of advocacy work going on right now in our state about potentially putting that into law, maybe in our next couple of legislative sessions.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Lauren Martin talks about that push in another earlier podcast. So what time does your day end after you go to all these meetings and respond to all these requests?
Well, that's the thing is, I just try to end it at, a somewhat reasonable time, like at 5 or 6. Maybe I'll take a little bit into the evening, but there are just always things to do. And we just kind of do our best to keep on track of the different things that we prioritize. Like I said, right now we're getting into our request for proposal time period where we're going to be really trying to do some very active outreach to communities that we haven't been able to serve through our funding yet. We would really like to expand into various cultural communities. We have a wide variety here in Minnesota to make sure that we are providing more supports there and more opportunities for funding. So we're just getting ready to kind of hit the streets in the fall and talk to folks and hopefully see if some of them will apply to receive some of these funds.
And so you're the folks that give out the money. What range of grants do you all give out?
It really varies. Some of it depends on the proposal that we've received or the size of the organization, their own capacity. But we have grants that could range anywhere from under $50,000 to over $300,000. They're generally over a 2 to 3 year period. And it really will depend on the size of their project.
Okay. And this is to respond to human trafficking or people at risk, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. They can use this resource. And again, here, our Safe Harbor program, our state funds that we're giving out are focused on sex trafficking. So they're looking at sex trafficking and exploitation and at risk. And then where we have some federal funds, those will be going to labor trafficking support.
Excellent. And so, Caroline, what do you do after you go meeting to meeting to meeting and respond to request after request? And you've been talking to someone who is so ignorant and backward, you love to choke them, but you're not going to do that because you're a nice, kind person who happens to be an attorney and understands you can't commit assault. So what do you do when you meet these ignorant people that you have to collaborate and partner with? What advice can you give us?
I really think the best way to approach that is through conversation. And you kind of have to start in small bites. You may hear a whole lot of things come out and you're like, oh no, this is a mess. They don't understand anything. And so you kind of have to take a few steps back and think about, okay, where can we start in this conversation to find some common ground? What kind of story or statistic or example can I provide to help them understand how something works in a way that maybe they didn't anticipate it? We've also done a lot of work, and I think this has been a national approach that has been really important, is whenever we hear data being used that's incorrect, we try to correct it right away and provide information about why we're correcting it and what the correct approach is. We also really try to help people understand that we don't want to sensationalize trafficking and exploitation. Sometimes it can be put out there in a very, dramatic way, and not that it's not an awful and dramatic experience for people to go through in their lives, but we want people to truly understand what it looks like from the perspective of survivors. And when you sort of see these glamorized depictions in advertising or entertainment or things like that, that doesn't always give you the full story of what survivors are going through. So we try to help them understand that and what it's really like for them.
Yeah, I think that I've read a lot of sensationalized stories that are ridiculous. And you're absolutely right. We don't need to build a tragedy and sensationalize something that's already tragic. I get calls and emails quite regularly. People will Facebook me and say, hey, there's a guy driving down the street in my neighborhood. He's looking at houses. Do you think he's a trafficker? I think, well, maybe he's a repairman looking for the right address. I don't know. Or maybe he's a rapist or a murderer. Maybe you should stay in the house. I mean, I don't know, but it's like
could be anything.
People think that traffickers are driving around waiting to snatch kids out of neighborhoods. And there's really enough very vulnerable young people to be manipulated and trafficked. It's not so common that they're riding down the street waiting to snatch kids into their cars and chain them to beds. It's a little more complex and manipulative, than that, I think. But
I agree. And I think the other sort of negative impact you have from all the sensationalism is sometimes victims will have something happen to them, but it doesn't look like those sensational stories. And so they think, that they're not going to think it's so bad. And of course it's bad. It's horrible what's happened to them, but we don't want anybody to compare If something has happened to them, we want to take it seriously and give them the support they need and, not create a situation in which somebody who has been harmed thinks they have to really have a dramatic story in order to get the attention they want.
Right. Like those pictures of kids in chains with tape across their mouth. When you advertise pictures like that, then you have young people who are actually being trafficked by their so-called boyfriend. But they look at this picture and they say, well, he's not chaining me and taping my mouth. And, so I must not be trafficked. I must not fit the definition. Or you see some prosecutors who say, well, is this trafficking? Because it doesn't really fit that caricature of what I think trafficking is. So it really, I think in the beginning, we should do no harm and not add stories that sort of distort the whole issue.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, and this is definitely something we've been looking at quite a bit across our partnership here in Minnesota, is how we work with survivors to help improve that understanding while at the same time making sure we're not exploiting the survivors and their stories, but finding ways to partner with them and to give them equal treatment in educating the public in the same way other folks are. Because I think it's really important that people know what those experiences look like and see who the people are. And if a survivor feels ready to share that information and to share that story, that can be very powerful for changing some of those misconceptions.
Absolutely. So you guys have a report that is going to be released. And so you're doing a presentation. What's the name of your presentation?
Safe Harbor for All.
And so what will you be presenting in that report?
So we're going to be doing a presentation at the Toledo International Trafficking Research Conference, and this will be a background on how that report was actually put together. As you mentioned earlier, there were a number of partnerships in putting together the Safe Harbor for All study here in Minnesota. At the Minnesota Department of Health, we received a directive from the legislature to create this research plan, a strategic plan for going forward. Through that, the University of Minnesota Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center, as well as Advocates for Human Rights and Rainbow Research, did the on-the-ground participatory research. And they talked with nearly 300 people in the community. That included people who identify as survivors, people who work in different parts of the field, people who identify as sex workers, or other people who identify more generally as having lived experience. And they put together this very important report that has several recommendations to our state as to how to proceed with looking at a safe harbor for all system, which would essentially be a partial decriminalization approach, among other things. And then at the Minnesota Department of Health, we took their very lengthy report and shortened it into a strategic plan and submitted both the strategic plan and the report to our legislature. So the presentation we're going to be doing in Toledo is going to be talking about the background for how the report came into being, and then spending a lot of time on the participatory research methods and the findings that came from that report, and then looking to the future about what next steps might occur.
Yeah, I love that you said we shortened it for the legislature, because I think that's one lesson that advocates need to learn is when you're talking to the legislature, they don't want to read pages and pages and pages of what you think is wonderful. They want the soundbite. They want it to be clear. And if you could give them like a picture book, or I sometimes say coloring book, so that they can understand what is happening, then you're going to get more bang for your buck. So you guys are going to be at our Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference. So I want to tell people to go to traffickingconference.com, and it is Caroline Palmer and Lauren Martin. Anybody else presenting?
No, it'll just be the two of us in that particular presentation.
Okay. And if they can't get to the conference, how can they get a copy of that report?
Absolutely. So we do have it up on our Minnesota Department of Health website, but it might be easiest for them just to contact me directly, and I'll get them to the correct link. My email address is Caroline, CAROLINE .Palmer, PALMER @state.mn.us.
Excellent. And so, Caroline, what did you major in, or were there anything specific that you took in law school? How did you prepare to become, a state advocate in human trafficking? For people who might be in law school, any tips and classes they need to take or moves they need to make after they graduate?
Well, probably the best advice I can give while in law school is if there are particular areas that you want to focus on, take those opportunities to get the internships or the clinics. Sometimes you can get class credit for those sorts of things and start going out in the field that you want to be a part of and make connections. I know for me in my law career, that's how I was able to move forward in the way that I had hoped to, was I just went and started working some time at the places that I was most interested in. And you can also take some classes. I mean, I think more and more law schools are starting to look at trafficking as a field of study, and they are offering classes, or sometimes you can find them online. But, it really, I think more than anything is about how you get engaged in the community and the type of work that's going on around you in order to kind of get more of that face-to-face on-the-ground experience.
Excellent advice. And so if you could, wave your magic wand for Minnesota, what would you say needs to happen next?
Wow. Well, I think we have done a great job of pulling together a strong system that is going across state agencies, going across community-based agencies, and really raising awareness. And I think our next steps are to increase how we do that for labor trafficking, because we've done it very well for sex trafficking and exploitation. And certainly those problems haven't gone away, but I think we can now expand all the lessons we've learned and take it even further into raising awareness about labor trafficking. And then hopefully that'll create more services and supports for those victims and more opportunities for them to come forward and find justice. And I think also helping people to understand the overlap between sex and labor trafficking that often occurs too. I think we're just kind of getting people to a place where they understand that too. So I would say, aside from trying to expand Safe Harbor to all ages, that's another big piece. The other is really getting labor trafficking out there and getting it the attention it deserves.
Excellent. Any parting advice for anybody out there that wants to be an advocate, a human trafficking advocate? Any advice that you would give them?
Well, I think we are so lucky right now to have so many great resources available in some of our states and from the federal government. I think about the Toledo conference. I think about some of the other conferences that are out there as well. There's lots of technical assistance providers who are putting together tools and resources. And if somebody is really wanting to engage with this field, I think it's so important to start learning about who those key resources are, where they can go, what conferences they can attend, to really hear from the people who are doing the important work on the ground. And just trying to engage that way and learn from the survivors' voices, most importantly, wherever there's that opportunity, learn from them and try to take that wisdom that they bring forward and have that inform everything they decide to do.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Caroline. I appreciate you taking the time to join us, and keep up the excellent work in Minnesota.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to speak with you today. I really enjoyed it.
Justice Scalia said that a lawyer's job is to take the romance, the mystery, the irony, and the ambiguity out of everything he or she touches. That's Caroline's job, to take our romantic notion that Minnesota's going to pass a safe harbor law and somehow it's magically going to protect and rescue every child in Minnesota. She has to take that notion and make it clear and make it actionable and make it reasonable and make it effective so that Minnesota can do its job the best that it can do. Make the words in the law come to life so that it can really help people. And she's doing that. In the last 2 years, they've identified 2,500 young people that were being trafficked, who were being exploited, or who were at risk of one of those. And this is through their no wrong door idea. They train people to understand trafficking and then report it to one of their several regional coordinators across the state, who are then connected to a network of service providers in their regions. That's genius. By the way, they also have 11 tribal nations, 9 of which receive funding to address trafficking. But what's really different about Minnesota is their perspective. Instead of funneling safe harbor through public safety channels, they provide a public health response. This allows them to look through the lens of public health in terms of health equity, social determinants of health. They have over 40 grantees across the state. That blows my mind and tells me that Minnesota is serious about significantly reducing sex trafficking, and labor trafficking is heavily on their minds these days. Caroline and her peeps are not sitting on the porch sparring with the puppies. She's in the communities running with the big dogs. And if you don't recognize this reference, it's from The Wire, the greatest show on earth. Anyway, you were born with the ability to change someone's life. Caroline is doing it through the legal profession. That's what she loves. Other people do it through social work, clinical counseling, law enforcement, public health, healthcare. It doesn't matter what your profession is. You can get involved and make a difference. I'll bring you many different people that have gotten involved and ask questions so they can tell you exactly what they do and how they do it. But I also provide you solo podcasts about different topics and take the time to go in depth on these topics. I'll do YouTube videos, offer online courses that teach you how to do various aspects of the work, and I'll bring on more guests that are doing exactly what you want to do. We are only just beginning. Stick with me and together I'll help you do exactly what you want to do in the field of anti-trafficking work. Let's not just do something, let's do the best thing. If you like this episode of Emancipation Nation, please subscribe and I'll send you the weekly podcast. Until then, the fight continues.